You thought shadow work would set you free, but instead, you feel like you're disappearing. The person you used to be, driven, certain, motivated, seems to have vanished into thin air. You wake up each morning and stare at goals that once excited you, now feeling nothing but emptiness where passion used to burn. Friends ask what's wrong, family wonders why you've changed, and you can't explain that you're not depressed or broken. You just don't recognize yourself anymore. But what if this isn't the end of your story? What if losing yourself is exactly what needed to happen? Carl Jung warned us about this moment. He called it the necessary dissolution that precedes rebirth. In his own words, "The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are, but first you must discover who you are not." The collapse of your familiar self isn't failure. It's the most crucial part of psychological transformation that no one talks about. You're standing in the sacred void between who you were and who you're becoming. And this void, uncomfortable as it feels, is exactly where real change happens. Let me tell you about Marcus. He's 34, works in finance, and spent 2 years doing intensive shadow work after a panic attack at his desk made him realize something fundamental was wrong with his life. He faced his childhood wounds, integrated his anger, recognized his people-pleasing patterns, and learned to set boundaries. The healing was profound. For the first time in decades, he felt genuinely at peace with himself. But then something unexpected happened. The ambition that had driven him since college simply evaporated. The promotion he'd been chasing for 3 years suddenly felt meaningless. The networking events that used to energize him now made his skin crawl. He'd sit in meetings and feel like he was watching someone else's life unfold, wondering how he'd ever cared so deeply about quarterly reports and client presentations. His girlfriend noticed the change. His colleagues whispered about his lack of drive. Marcus himself felt terrified. Had the healing process somehow broken something essential inside him? Was this what recovery looked like? Or had he traded his problems for something worse? What Marcus was experiencing wasn't a side effect of shadow work gone wrong. It was shadow work going exactly right. Here's what happens when you truly face your shadow. When you stop running from the parts of yourself you've been taught to reject, and instead turn toward them with curiosity and compassion. You don't just heal the wounds, you expose the entire machinery that's been running your life from the unconscious. Suddenly you can see how much of your motivation was actually fear wearing the mask of ambition. How much of your drive was just sophisticated anxiety dressed up as success. The shadow isn't just your anger, jealousy, or selfishness, though those are certainly part of it. The shadow contains everything you've disowned about yourself, including the parts that once felt essential to your identity. Your relentless productivity might have been shadowing a deep fear of worthlessness. Your people-pleasing might have been covering a terror of abandonment. Your perfectionism might have been masking a belief that you were fundamentally flawed. When you integrate these patterns, when you see them clearly and heal the wounds they were protecting, something profound shifts. The old motivational system doesn't just change. It completely shuts down, because it was never truly yours to begin with. Jung understood this as the death of the persona, that carefully constructed mask we wear to navigate the world and meet society's expectations. But here's what most people don't realize. We don't just have one persona. We have multiple layers of false selves, each one built to protect us from different fears, each one convinced it's the real you. There's the achiever persona, driven by the fear of being seen as lazy or worthless. There's the helper persona, motivated by the terror of being abandoned or unloved. There's the rebel persona, fueled by the need to prove you can't be controlled or diminished. There's the perfectionist persona, powered by the belief that mistakes equal rejection. These personas aren't evil. They developed for good reasons. They helped you survive difficult circumstances, navigate social expectations, and get your needs met when you didn't know how else to do it. But they're not who you really are underneath. They're survival strategies that have been running so long, you forgot they were strategies at all. Shadow work strips away these false selves one by one. False selves. It reveals the difference between your authentic desires and your inherited obligations. Between what you actually want and what you think you should want, between who you really are and who you've been performing to be. And once you see that difference clearly, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to being motivated by fears you now understand. You can't return to chasing goals that belong to someone you no longer are. This is what Jung called the nigredo phase of psychological alchemy, the necessary blackening, the dissolution that must happen before any real transformation can begin. In medieval alchemy, nigredo represented the death of the old form, the breakdown of existing structures so that something entirely new could emerge. But our culture has no language for this phase. We're taught that healing should feel good immediately, that growth should be linear and measurable, that progress should always look like forward movement. We expect shadow work to work like taking medicine. You identify the problem, apply the solution, and feel better. Instead, shadow work often works like surgery. The procedure is successful, but the recovery is long, disorienting, and nothing like what you expected. You're left with this strange emptiness where familiar patterns used to be, this eerie quiet where the constant noise of fear-based motivation once roared. During this phase, you might find yourself unable to care about things that used to consume you. Career goals that once seemed vital now feel arbitrary. Relationships that used to excite you might feel performative. Hobbies that brought joy might feel forced. Social activities that energized you could start feeling draining. This isn't depression in the clinical sense. You're not hopeless or unable to function. You're not convinced that life is meaningless or that you're fundamentally worthless. You're just not motivated by the same things anymore. And without those familiar carrots and sticks driving you forward, you don't know how to move. Friends and family might worry about you. They might suggest you're going through a phase, that you need to get back to your old self, that maybe you've taken this inner work too far. But you know something they don't. You can't go back because there's nothing to go back to. The old self wasn't your authentic self. It was a collection of adaptive strategies that served their purpose and are now naturally dissolving. Jung wrote extensively about this phenomenon in his concept of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, rather than who you think you should be. But he was clear that individuation doesn't begin with finding yourself. It begins with losing the selves you thought you were. This process requires what he called holding the tension of opposites. You're suspended between identities, no longer the person you were, but not yet the person you're becoming. You're in the liminal space, the threshold between one way of being and another. And liminal spaces are always uncomfortable because they're spaces of pure potential where anything could happen. Most people can't tolerate this discomfort. They rush back into action, trying to resurrect their old motivations or manufacture new ones. They sign up for courses, set ambitious goals, throw themselves into new projects, anything to escape the void. But Jung warned that if you try to skip this phase, if you rush back into doing before the transformation is complete, you risk building a new life on the same old foundations. You might look different on the outside, but you'll be running the same unconscious programs that brought you to shadow work in the first place. The same fears will drive you, just dressed in different clothes. The same wounds will run your life, just hidden beneath new accomplishments. The void isn't your enemy. It's your teacher. It's creating the space necessary for something authentic to emerge. Not another persona, not another adaptive strategy, but your actual self. The self that doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. The self that doesn't derive its worth from external validation. The self that exists simply because it exists, not because it achieves or produces or performs. But this self doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It doesn't come with a detailed action plan or a 5-year strategy. It emerges slowly, quietly, like dawn breaking after the longest night you've ever experienced. When this authentic self begins to stir, you might not recognize it at first. It doesn't speak in the urgent language of your old motivations. It doesn't scream about deadlines or whisper about inadequacy. Instead, it communicates through gentle nudges, quiet curiosities, and unexplainable attractions to things you've never considered before. Maybe you find yourself drawn to activities that serve no productive purpose. Watching clouds move across the sky, having conversations with strangers that lead nowhere, creating art that no one will see. Maybe you start saying no to invitations that once excited you, not out of depression or social anxiety, but because something inside you recognizes they don't align with who you're becoming. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the transcendent function, the psychological mechanism that bridges conscious and unconscious, ego and self, who you were and who you're meant to be. But this function doesn't operate according to the timelines we're used to. It doesn't respond to forcing or optimization or strategic planning. Let me share another story. Rebecca is 29, a marketing executive who built her entire identity around being indispensable at work. She was the one who stayed late, took on extra projects, and made herself essential to every campaign. Her colleagues admired her drive. Her boss praised her dedication. Her family was proud of her success. But underneath all that achievement was a terrified child who learned that love was conditional on performance, that her worth was measured by how much she could give, how much she could achieve, how perfectly she could meet everyone else's needs while ignoring her own. After 18 months of deep therapy work, Rebecca couldn't bring herself to check her emails with the same urgency. The thought of another strategic planning meeting made her feel physically ill. She'd sit at her desk and wonder who this person was, who used to care so deeply about click-through rates and conversion metrics. Her manager noticed the change in her performance. Her friends worried she was burning out. Rebecca herself felt like she was failing at the only thing she'd ever been good at. But what she was experiencing wasn't failure. It was the natural result of no longer being willing to betray herself for external validation. The old Rebecca had been motivated by a sophisticated form of self-abandonment. Every late night at the office was a way of avoiding the quiet voice inside that whispered she was enough exactly as she was. Every extra project was a desperate attempt to earn love that she already deserved simply by existing. Once she saw these patterns clearly, once she understood how they developed and why they served her, she couldn't unknow what she now knew about herself. She couldn't go back to being motivated by the fear of not being enough because she finally understood, on a cellular level, that she had always been enough. This is the paradox of shadow work that catches most people off guard. You expect to feel more motivated after healing, not less. You expect to have more energy, not to feel completely drained. You expect clarity about your purpose, not confusion about everything you once thought mattered. But here's what's actually happening during this phase of apparent stagnation. Your psyche is reorganizing itself at the deepest levels. The neural pathways that once fired automatically in response to fear are being rewired. The belief systems that shaped every decision are being examined and either integrated or released. The identity structures that felt so solid are being revealed as temporary constructions that served their purpose and are now dissolving. Jung compared this process to the metamorphosis of a butterfly. The caterpillar doesn't just grow wings and learn to fly. It literally dissolves into primordial soup. Its entire cellular structure breaks down into an undifferentiated mass before reorganizing into something completely new. You're in the soup right now. The old structures have dissolved, but the new ones haven't fully formed yet. There's nothing wrong with you. You're not broken or stuck or moving backward. You're in the most transformative phase of psychological development that a human being can experience. But this phase has its own timing that can't be rushed or optimized. Just as you can't make a seed grow faster by pulling on the sprout, you can't force your authentic self to emerge before it's ready. Trying to skip this dissolution phase is like trying to become a butterfly while still insisting on being a caterpillar. The silence you're experiencing isn't emptiness, it's spaciousness. For perhaps the first time in your adult life, there's room inside you for something real to grow. The constant chatter of should and must and have to has finally quieted enough for a different voice to be heard. This voice doesn't speak in imperatives. It doesn't create urgency or demand immediate action. It speaks in whispers and suggestions and gentle invitations. It communicates through the body as much as the mind, through what feels expansive rather than contractive, what brings energy rather than drains it, what feels aligned rather than forced. Learning to hear this voice requires a different kind of listening than you're used to. It requires sitting with uncertainty rather than rushing toward solutions. It requires trusting the process rather than controlling the outcome. It requires believing that something is happening even when you can't see evidence of progress. This is perhaps the most countercultural thing you can do in a society that worships productivity and visible achievement. You're learning to value being overdoing, depth over speed, authenticity over approval. You're developing what Jung called a religious attitude toward your own becoming. Not religious in the institutional sense, but in the sense of approaching your transformation with reverence and trust. The old you needed constant external validation to feel worthy. The new you is learning that worth is intrinsic, unchangeable, not dependent on what you produce or achieve or become. The old you was motivated by what was missing, what needed to be fixed, what had to be proven. The new you will be motivated by what wants to be expressed, shared, created from a place of fullness rather than emptiness. But this new motivation hasn't arrived yet, and that's exactly as it should be. You're still in the sacred pause between one way of being and another. Still learning to trust that something authentic is gestating in the darkness, preparing to be born when the conditions are right. Your only job right now is to stay present with this transformation. To stop fighting the void and start inhabiting it with curiosity rather than fear. To recognize that the emptiness isn't a sign that something went wrong, it's a sign that something went exactly right. The authentic self that's emerging doesn't need your old motivations because it operates from an entirely different source. It's not driven by inadequacy or fear or the need to prove anything. It's drawn by love, by truth, by the simple joy of expressing what wants to be expressed through you. When this new motivation begins to stir, and it will, though not according to any timeline you try to impose, you'll recognize it immediately. It won't feel like the frantic energy of your past. It won't come with urgency or demand immediate results. Instead, it will feel like coming home to yourself after a long journey through foreign territory. You might find yourself interested in things that make no logical sense to your old self. Maybe you'll want to learn pottery not because it's productive, but because something in you responds to working with clay. Maybe you'll feel drawn to volunteer work that serves no career advancement, but feeds something deeper than ambition. Maybe you'll discover that what you really want is simpler than you thought. More connection, less performance, more meaning, less achievement, more presence, less productivity. These aren't the burning ambitions that used to drive you. They're the quiet callings of your authentic nature. They emerge not from what you lack, but from what you love. Not from what you fear, but from what feels true. Not from who you think you should become, but from who you've always been underneath all the performing. This is what Jung meant when he wrote about the return to the self with a capital S. Not the ego that needs constant validation, but the deeper essence that is already whole, already complete, already worthy of love exactly as it is. The journey through shadow work hasn't taken anything essential away from you. It's cleared away the illusions so you can finally see what was always there. It's removed the noise so you can hear the whisper. It's dissolved the false structures so something authentic can finally take root and grow. So if you're in the void right now, if you're feeling unmotivated and wondering what happened to the person you used to be, I want you to know this. You haven't lost yourself. You found yourself. You're just learning to recognize who you actually are when you're not performing, not achieving, not proving your worth through constant doing. The old you was never meant to be permanent. It was a necessary stage in your development, a collection of adaptive strategies that served their purpose and are now naturally dissolving to make room for something more real, more sustainable, more genuinely you. Trust this process. Trust the silence. Trust that something beautiful is being born in the darkness, even when you can't see it yet. Your authentic self isn't missing. It's just waiting for the noise to quiet down enough for you to recognize its voice. The void isn't the end of your story. It's the comma between the life you were living and the life you're meant to live. And that life, the one that emerges from truth rather than fear, from love rather than lack, from authenticity rather than performance, is worth every moment of uncertainty you're experiencing now. Welcome to the space between who you were and who you're becoming. This is where real transformation happens. This is where you finally come home to yourself.